Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the latest episode of A Fork in Time. My name is Chris Capola, and I'm joined here by Robert, who's been on a couple of our other podcasts. You want to introduce yourself for a sec?
Hey, Chris, glad to be here again. This is Robert Koshu. Glad to be here with Fork in Time. Very excited about this episode today.
So this is a concept episode. This is something we're going to try. Um, and what we're going to do is we're recording the audio for this episode, which a lot of you are probably listening to through your favorite podcast catcher, Apple, I like Podcast Republic, or whatever else you listen to, Stitcher. Um, but we're also going to put together a video. So this is going to be released as both an audio podcast and a video because I think this episode, the topic kind of lends itself to some visuals we're going to put together. So if you are listening to us on a podcast, we're going to try and make sure that you don't lose too much. But if you're interested in kind of seeing us and also kind of some visual images about what we're doing, we'll make sure that there's a YouTube link in the show notes. So hopefully this works out pretty well. Robert, do you want to go ahead and introduce what our fork for today is?
Absolutely. So, our fork today is actually on the Peninsula Campaign. So, we are in the middle of the Civil War, or well, let me rephrase that. The Civil War has started, so we're early 1862. So, the only thing that has really happened so far in the Civil War is the South has succeeded, the Northern armies and the South armies clashed outside of Manassas Junction, Virginia, sometimes referred to as Bull Run, kind of blindly groping at each other at that point. The Anaconda Plan that Winfield Scott put together began to be implemented, and Grant took charge of the Army of Tennessee at that point and actually put together a campaign where he captured Forts Henry and Donelson at the top of the Cumberland Valley and forced the Confederates out of the eastern part or the western part of Tennessee down the Tennessee River. So that's kind of where we are. So after Manassas or Bull Run, General George McClellan has taken over the Army of the Potomac. He actually names it the Army of the Potomac. And he is given charge and he organizes it into a fighting force. He organizes the corps together and he gets it set up. In the South, this is not the Army of Northern Virginia we all think about. Robert E. Lee is the adjutant general in chief back in Richmond, hanging out with Jeff Davis all the time. Joseph Johnston is actually in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia at that point. So he's in charge, and he has with him three wings of the Army: Daniel Harvey Hill, Longstreet, and Magruder are his three commanders. Jackson is out in the valley of the Shenandoah with his corps, kind of doing his thing out there. And McClellan has people that we really have heard of, but not really in a lot of ways. Bull Sumner has Second Corps. Third Corps is Huntsman, and the Fourth Corps is Keyes, with the First Corps, First Division of Franklin, and then General George Sykes of the killed my lover, who was killed my wife's lover, who was the nephew of Francis Scott Key. He is running the Reserve Infantry Corps out of New York at that point.
Okay.
So they kind of get set up, and Lincoln starts issuing orders. I want you to attack. He decides he wants to attack. He wants to capture Fort Monroe, run up the peninsula, and capture Yorktown. That is the plan. Lincoln issues him orders to attack by February 22nd. He starts to attack. He backs off a little bit. In the real world, he gets a lot of intelligence reports that tell him that he's outnumbered 4-1. So he thinks, I don't have enough manpower. We're going to enter a siege. So I bring my siege guns in. Have a little bit of trouble getting everything together because the USS Virginia, sometimes referred to as the USS Merrimack, is running around sinking ships all over the place as it goes through. They handle that, but he still brings in the siege guns as he goes through.
And so he brings in these siege guns. And by the way, we're going to try and drop in an image here. I think that'll help understand, because, if you look at Civil War guns, these are still wheeled. You have the old Napoleon cannons. That's the only way to move these things. So when you think about these siege guns, we're not thinking those. We're thinking these giant mortars, right?
Yeah, correct. Big mortars having there. So he's brought in, but he's left one corps under McDowell back up in DC, because the one thing is Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton say, you may not expose Washington, D.C. to the Southern Army. There has to always be something there to protect our capital, because at this point in the war, they're playing capture the flag. If the Confederates can capture DC, they win the war. If the northern forces capture, the Union forces capture Richmond, they win the war. That's how everybody thinks about it. That this is the old style Napoleon campaigns. Go forth, capture the capital of the country. Jeff Davis has fantasies of walking into the White House and slamming down his demands on Lincoln's desk and getting the signature.
I think it's really similar in our discussions about this. This is what the British wanted to do in 1812. This was their mindset. This was, you win a war by capturing the enemy's capital. That's what you do. When you do that, they give up, and that's all of it. That's all you have to really do. That did not work out for the British in 1812.
And really wasn't going to be the end all be all at the Civil War at the end. So, Chris, why don't you set the fork up as we go through?
So, to do this, and we're going to get a little more into detail in a little bit, McClellan decides to try and end run all of the defenses in Northern Virginia and land on a place called the Virginia Peninsula. At the tip of the Virginia Peninsula is a place called Fort Monroe that the United States actually held on to during the initial secession crisis, kind of like a Fort Sumter, which was a military facility. The United States kept it, and everything outside of it went with the Confederacy. But because we held on to it, now McClellan can sail right down the Chesapeake, can land at Monroe, and can march right to Richmond. It's maybe a 20, 30 mile march. It's not long at all. And he can end run all of the defenses, and he can basically snatch Richmond before Johnston, who's up north, knows what he's doing and has a chance to come down and do anything to stop it. So that's the idea. That's the plan at the point. That is what Lincoln has been sold by McClellan. And we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to see what happens if McClellan actually did that, because he doesn't do that. But we'll talk about what wound up happening, and we'll talk about how this could have changed things. So we'll take a quick commercial break real quick and come back and start discussing with the more detailed what did. All right? See you in a couple.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Chris Coppola, joined by Robert Koshu, and we're talking about the Peninsula Campaign. When kind of as an American, when you learn about the Civil War, this seems like one of those ones that isn't really that big, wouldn't you say? It's not that well known.
It's not known because it gets overshadowed by what comes after it. The Peninsula Campaign is just, it is the easiest way to think about it. The Peninsula Campaign, over a period of 6 to 8 weeks, had roughly 52,000 casualties. Mm-hmm. Gettysburg in 3 days had 64,000 casualties.
Yeah.
So you really, and then there's two parts to that. That's number one. It gets overshadowed. The second part is the old adage, to the victors go the writing of the history. The North won, so they get to write the history. And we don't want to write the history around the campaign we didn't win. We want to push out the battles we won. Those are the important ones to push out.
So we're going to take a step back, start talking about what wound up happening. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Civil War itself. Right now, you're looking at a map of the United States in 1860 with the states outlined and the territories kind of off on their own. In 1860, the Democratic Party, who had been the party of power for a long time, split between candidates and gave an opportunity to Abraham Lincoln to come in as kind of a third. At this point, he's kind of a third party. The Republicans are kind of a third party. Come in and win for the first time without a single Southern state. The Southern states did not really like that. And starting in December, keep in mind, the inauguration is in March still at this point of 61. In December of 1860, South Carolina secedes. They say, we are not sticking around to see what happens here. We are gone. After that happens, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and another state / country. Robert, do you know which one I'm talking about?
That would be my home state, the great state of Texas.
All secede. They all break away and start the process of forming their own government. For some of you, you're sitting there thinking, I left out a couple, didn't I? I didn't. I'll get to it. Like I mentioned, there's a series of forts that are property of the federal government, that are protected by federal troops, that were built kind of in reaction to 1812 to protect ports from foreign navies. We didn't say it was the British, but it was the British. So, for example, you had Fort Monroe, which we talked a little bit about. We're going to get a lot more into that, which was built in the Chesapeake Bay to protect Norfolk, Virginia. You also had Fort Jay in New York, which was built to protect the port of New York. And then you had a place called Fort Sumter, which was built to protect the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. It just so happens it needed to be protected from Charleston, South Carolina. So in the process of breaking away South Carolina, and we're not going to get into a lot of the back and forth here, South Carolina, their militia troops demand the surrender of the fort at Fort Sumter, and they start shooting at it to take it by force. Led by a character we're going to talk about later, Pierre G.T. Beauregard, Gustav Thomas Beauregard. You could spend most of a podcast just naming this guy.
Yeah.
So this is the start. This is when the shooting starts. This is the beginning of an actual war. At this point, this happens in, as I remember, what is this?
April 1861.
April 12th, 1861. Lincoln has assumed command. He has become the president. He has been inaugurated back in March. In April, the shooting actually starts. And once they fire on Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls up the state militias. The state militias are run by each governor. He brings them together and says, all right, we need to go down. And now that the South has started this fight, we are going to go down and preserve the United States, preserve the Union, and do that. As soon as he does that, 3 more states say, we're actually not on board with this. Those states being the first one to go. Less than a week later, Virginia secedes. And Virginia is super important because all during the lead up to it, Virginia is kind of one of the 2 colonies that's the birthplace of the United States. Them in Massachusetts, the history, all the presidents they produced. Virginia is super important, not only for the fact that it basically borders the capital of the United States, but it's a huge state. It secedes a week later. Not long after that, literally maybe 2 weeks later, two more states secede, those being North Carolina and Tennessee. Those are the last two states to secede. So, and I can tell you from personal experience, if you're a fourth grader in North Carolina, letting your history teacher know that the state's a draft dodger will get you sent to the principal's office. I don't know how many third graders are listening to this, just understand that. So now we've got the war set up. We now know, which sides are which. Now we've got a map up of the war as it happened. You've got a couple of border states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, Oklahoma Territory, some other places. It looks like you've got a pretty wide front, right? But the thing is, and you don't. You've really only got two places that all of the fighting is going to take place. One is the Western Theater, which we're going to talk about real quickly, and one is the Eastern Theater. And the thing about the Eastern Theater, you've got both the capital of the Confederacy. They decided to establish the capital at Richmond. It's 2 hours away from Washington nowadays. In good traffic, it's 2 hours away. It's kind of crazy to think how close they are and how much time is spent trying to get between them in this entire war. The other area, and the other area is out along the Mississippi. And the reason Mississippi is important is it's the only way to move the amount of supplies and troops you're talking about. You've got the Appalachian Mountains right here in the middle, which make it next to impossible to have these two theaters talk to each other, to communicate and support each other. So it's almost as if there's two separate things going on that in the end are going to come together and help each other, and one is going to play on the other to finally settle what happens. So we mentioned First Bull Run, which are really just two almost armed gangs going at each other. That's a really
apt description. The uniforms of each, to put it this way, there were some Union troops whose gray state militia stuff were wearing gray uniforms, and there were some Union troops or Confederate troops who were wearing the state militia blue uniforms.
And just about every general was a West Point graduate, so they still all had blue uniforms too.
Yep. Yeah. It totally is it is somebody referred to it as two blind boxers facing each other in the ring. And what made it more interesting is also Washington society thinks it's going to be a picnic. So they all come out, the high society people, they all come out in their carriages to watch the picnic, to watch the parade, as it were, without realizing what's fixing to happen.
Because this is going to be a parade. This is going to be just one big parade, just marching. I mean, it's 120 miles. We're just going to start marching south, and we will be in Richmond before Christmas.
Yep. Right? Yeah. I mean, and that's the whole thought on the Union level, with the exception of one general at this point, William T. Sherman, who actually ended up spending some downtime after Manassas because he was ruled as unfit to command. He had a little bit of a mental breakdown after Manassas because he actually sat and said, hey, it's not going to be that. They're going to fight. It's going to be thousands of dead, and we don't know what all. So he spends some time down, and then when he comes back, he actually leaves the East and gets thrown out to Grant in the West.
Kind of the B team. I always picture the West is kind of like, okay, we'll just send some people out there. Sure, you're helping the cause. The big show is the East.
Always the East, because the capitals are there, the news media is there, everything is there. So that's that is the big piece.
So after First Manassas, you have the current commander of the Union forces, which are not the Army of the Potomac yet,
Right.
but Irving McDowell, he gets removed, and they bring in somebody who had one or two impressive tiny victories out in Western Virginia, which is now known as West Virginia.
Yep.
Because these are the counties that, when Virginia seceded, they decided not to. So they seceded from the secession and stayed with the U.S. Small commander had a couple of successes out there, and they bring in who?
George McClellan, he was a railroad magnate, graduated from West Point in 1846. He was actually part of George Pickett's class of West Point and actually moved up with that. So he had stayed in the Army for a little bit after graduation, and then actually decided to go do business, and then came back to the Army right at the Civil War to kind of get started. And what McClellan was exceptionally good at was putting an army together.
And that's kind of why I talked about Bull Run the way I did, because he changed that. He changed that mindset or that nature of what the Army was.
He put the structure around it, put the corps commanders in, put brigade commanders in. He is responsible for putting Winfield Scott Hancock in charge of a division, who then actually moves up. Hancock was known as a quartermaster guy. And he's like, you knew combat. We're going to put you in, and put him in charge of got promoted to general, and now he's running a division at this point.
So McClellan comes in and spends months building an army.
Basically, May 1862, if I remember Bull Run correctly, May or June of 1861, sorry. Yeah. Until early 1862. So they spend good 6 months training and organizing, equipping, bringing in these recruits that have been recruited from across the North. We were talking earlier about I was in Madison, Wisconsin last year, or 2 years ago now. And what most people don't realize is the football stadium for the University of Wisconsin there in Madison is built on the campground that they established to build the actual regiments that were sent to the Civil War. Okay. And so, all of the states did this. They put their little groups together, put their regiments together, and then marched them or put them on the train to Washington, D.C.
McClellan made him an army out of them. And he's sitting there. It's always interesting to think about the time, the seasonal nature of war, but this is still the point when you kind of stop fighting around October, November, and you pick up again in the spring campaign season, come March and April again. So he's still working. He's built this army. Lincoln is getting very impatient. McClellan has built this nice tool and doesn't want to get it dirty. I think that's the best way.
One of Lincoln's comments about McClellan was, I'd like to see if General McClellan would like to let me borrow the army if he doesn't want to use it.
Yes. It's he's built a nice lawnmower, and his neighbor wants to borrow it to take it out and get it dirty almost, and he doesn't want to. So finally, McClellan decides on this idea of this one master stroke. And this is one of the other things I'm going to throw up is map of Virginia, because it's kind of important. We already talked about how thin the East is, but I actually am giving credit. One of those British historians that you always used to see on like A&E and Discovery and History Channel back when they showed the History Channel. I'm going to try and drop in a picture of John Keegan, because you may not know the name, but if you watch those, you're going to recognize this man's face. Wrote a really interesting book on the Civil War, and he talks about Virginia as a ladder, because you've got the Shenandoah Mountains over to the west, you've got the Chesapeake Bay over to the east, and as you go south, even up to Baltimore, you've got the Patapsco River, then you've got the Pawtuxet, then you've got the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the Anna, the York, the James. And these are just rungs on this ladder between these two, the Shenandoah and the Chesapeake. And the entire campaign, so much of the Eastern Civil War is going from one rung to the next, going from the Potomac down to the Rappahannock, down to the York, down to the James. So that is kind of the problem that McClellan is facing. All of these rivers form a barrier, a really natural barrier to stop the direct movement down to Richmond.
One thing you got to remember as you're thinking through this, that there is no interstate highway. So they're moving,
Yes.
and bridges are easy to destroy with black powder.
Yes.
Put a bunch of black powder down underneath a wooden bridge and you light it off, and there's not a bridge there anymore. So you have to rebuild the bridge. So
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So he looks at the map and says, you know what? There's that little place down at the very far end. We still have Fort Monroe, don't we? Why, yes, we do. So, and looking at a map of this, I keep thinking about Incheon or an Anzio, one of these where they're defending right here. So why don't we just jump all the way around it and come in from the other side?
do an end run around.
And so that's what the idea is. They do wind up landing at Fort Monroe. They start marching up the Virginia Peninsula, and he spends 1 month besieging the town of Yorktown. Yes, by the way, it's that Yorktown. It's the American Revolution Yorktown, where we won independence. He spends a month just laying siege lines and taking over that. A month later, he makes it 10 miles up the road to Williamsburg, which was the old capital of the colony of Virginia and is still a wonderfully, restored and put together place. Right down the road from there is Jamestown, the first English settlement. The reason I'm talking about all of this is it's a really cool area. It is. I kind of begrudge some Richmond family of mine because they got to take field trips to there. I did not. Because it is so close. You can literally take an elementary school field trip, pile on the bus, and go down there. So basically another month later, and he has finally gotten to the outskirts of Richmond. And when I say the outskirts of Richmond, I mean it. Today, 295, the Richmond Beltway, runs through these battlefields. One of them is actually basically the site of Richmond Airport. The Battle of Fair Oaks was right where Richmond Airport is. So you actually have the story of American officers, of Union officers, setting their watches by the church bells of Richmond. That's how close they were. They could hear them. Joseph Johnston has finally come south. He's brought his troops out of the northern Virginia, kind of Fredericksburg, Rappahannock area, down to protect the city of Richmond. He attacks part of his force because it's moving so slowly and constantly bringing these massive siege guns that it gives even Johnston, who a lot of people think Lincoln said that McClellan had a case of the slows, but I think the same could be said about Johnston.
Johnston had a case of the slows, and Johnston also, him and Jeff Davis just didn't get along. And it got worse as the war went on, actually, but they didn't get along at all to begin with. Jefferson Davis was probably the North's greatest ally in the way he appointed generals, because he appointed people like Joseph Johnston, Braxton Bragg, people that were his political buddies, Hood eventually, and most of them were fine examples of the Peter Principle, where you get promoted to your level of incompetence.
And if there's one thing battle has a way of revealing that. But so it's almost as if a boxer, McClellan has telegraphed this punch for so long that anybody realizes what's coming, and he's sitting there, and Johnston actually launches an attack on McClellan. This leads to the Battle of Fair Oaks. Kind of inconclusive, doesn't really succeed in pushing the Union back, but it does succeed in one huge goal, which is removing Joseph Johnston from Missouri.
Yep.
He is wounded in that battle, and the special advisor for military matters to Jefferson Davis takes over. Who is that man?
Robert E. Lee takes over and becomes the Robert E. Lee of legend. After this, he brings in Stonewall. He puts D.H. Hill, kind of pushes him to the side, leaves him in a little bit. But in reality, it becomes Jackson and Longstreet with two wings of the army. And
as he takes over, he starts planning this massive offensive to, maybe not massive, this actually active offensive. We're actually going to try and protect the city instead of just waiting for the Union to do whatever they want to do, and we're going to react to that. No, we actually have a say in this. So Lee plans and executes what are collectively known as the 7 Days Battles, and basically scares McClellan back all the way up the peninsula, and he evacuates his troops back up to Washington. So that is what wound up happening. Is that kind of a, do you think that's a fair assessment, Robert?
That's about right. So where our fort takes place is much earlier in the campaign. He runs in.
Let's start attaching some dates, because dates are really important to this. So go ahead.
So early 1862, February 1862, Lincoln issued an order and said, attack or else. So he goes and he does the Fortress Monroe and he starts attacking. But where it really becomes important is at this point, instead, he tells Lincoln, look, if I could get McDowell, forget the siege guns. I don't want the siege guns. They're too much. If I could get McDowell, I bring McDowell down. He comes down from the north. I come in sweeping around. Maybe we can catch Joe Johnston between us, cut him off from Richmond, and then capture, destroy the Army of Virginia. And then we march on Richmond without that Army of Virginia in the middle.
Numbers wise, what does this look like? Who's on the Confederate side? What does that ratio look like? Who's actually protecting Richmond from the Monroe side?
Not much. It was Johnston by himself, but he was more up north shielding from Washington. So once you get in between, if you move aggressively, as our fort presupposes, McClellan. So we're actually asking McClellan to not be McClellan a little bit. So one of the things we'll do is we'll assume that Pinkerton data with the large numbers never hit him. He decides not to bring along siege guns. He thinks that's a waste of time. And so he goes straight out. He does the end run around and puts himself between Richmond and Joe Johnston at that point.
And he could, because he outnumbered Confederate forces on the peninsula something stupid like 5-1.
Yeah, like 5-1. Yeah, he had way more troops there than he needed to.
And by the way, the other thing is this is his Army of the Potomac that he has trained, that is ready to go. And the Confederates
had an implicit trust in McClellan, to the point that in the real world, he gets removed from command, gets put back in, and there were actually rumors before Gettysburg that he was going to get put back in charge again before Gettysburg. Meade ended up getting it, but there were several people in the Army of the Potomac that were excited because McClellan was going to come back again.
Because he built that army.
Yeah, they loved him for whatever reason.
But this army this was the A team. This was his top. This was the top Union force, and they outnumber Magruder, who's the Confederate commander on the peninsula. And by the way, these were not, the other side was not the A team. The A team was up at Fredericksburg.
Yep. Yeah. Magruder knew what he was doing, but Magruder did it by brashness. You know, Magruder actually had Quaker guns, which he has some artillery, but he doubled his number of artillery by painting a bunch of logs black and putting them on the hill. So McClellan realizes when he starts looking, he goes, hold on a minute. Only half those guns are firing at me. Why aren't the other? Oh, hang on. So he runs and he gets Magruder, knocks Magruder off. So now he's got Johnston. He's got McDowell coming down from the north from DC.
And so fast forward, he takes Richmond and cuts off Johnston. Johnston surrenders. By the way, here's two other things that have happened right now that are happening. And this is why I was like, well, let's put some dates to stuff. March 17th, they set sail. They land, and again, this is something like 40, 50 miles to Richmond. This is not very far at all. It takes him 3 months, 2 to 3 months to get there. In that month, in one of those months where he is just sitting in front of Yorktown building siege defenses, two things happen. You take yours, I'll take the other.
Okay.
What's the first thing
so
that
the
happens?
first thing that happens is Albert Sidney Johnston, who, according to Jeff Davis, was the leading general at the time. He had actually been a major general in 2 armies prior to the Confederacy. He was a major general in the Army of the Nation of Republic of Texas. He had participated at the Battle of San Jacinto under Sam Houston, and then he had become a major general in the United States Army and actually was running the Department of California at the outbreak of the Civil War and was forced to resign and move around. So he had gathered forces, and Beauregard, the guy whose name takes forever, he actually came and helped Johnston in Corinth, Mississippi. Corinth, Mississippi was a very large rail town. So just north of Corinth was an area called Pittsburgh Landing. Also, we call it today Shiloh. Grant brought the Army of the Tennessee down from where Fort Donelson and Fort Henry. Don Carlos Buell is bringing over the Army of the Ohio together, and Grant has set up his army there in Tennessee at Pittsburgh Landing to train it more while he waits for Buell to join with him. Albert Sidney Johnston decides we don't want them to join up, so we're going to attack. He marches forward with Beauregard. Beauregard had the actual plan. The plan fell apart. They attacked. They won the first day. In that first day, though, Albert Sidney Johnston is killed. Part of what a lot of people believe is he fought a duel while when he was in Texas, and was injured in that duel and severed a nerve in his leg. So when he was shot through his femoral artery, didn't realize he was shot, bled to death. So he does that. Day 2 of the battle arrives. Don Carlos Buell moves his troops in overnight. They come down and sweep Beauregard down back to Corinth. And part of what a lot of people don't realize at that point is Shiloh is at that point the largest battle, single day battle or 2-day battle that had occurred on American soil, because there were 23,000 casualties at Shiloh.
And that was shocking. That caused people to stand back for a second.
They did not even have field hospitals determined on how to set up Shiloh. Shiloh is an interesting battlefield to visit, because you will see they didn't know what they were doing. It wasn't much better than Bull Run in a lot of ways. Didn't know what they were doing. So that's the first thing that happened. So the South has a major defeat in that Western theater that Chris talked about.
That's April, so within a month of landing at Monroe.
Yep, exactly.
And then 1 month, May 1st, New Orleans falls to a combined operation between the United States Army and the Navy working together. Now they captured the largest city in the South and also a huge economic center, because now the South can't export all of their materials coming down the Mississippi.
Yeah, New Orleans
Mhm.
was the major port at that time in the
Mhm.
United States.
So they cannot get the South. Their idea is to kind of play footsie with the British and the French, who we talked about this in another episode I did, are intervening in Mexico right now, still have troops in the area, and they want to play footsie with the French and the British to, we'll give you cotton if you'll support us. Oh, we don't have a port. We can't sell you cotton. There's nowhere for us to give it to you. So Shiloh is a massive battle in the West. It kind of, when the numbers start coming back, it throws everybody back on their heels for a second. They think about it. Right after that, the largest city, economic hub of the South falls.
Right. So
Then their capital falls.
Yeah, I was going to say, so let's recap. So in basically a month and a half in our fork, the capital of Richmond has fallen. Shiloh has happened. So the major army of the Western Theater, the Army of Tennessee, I think was the name
Yes.
that Johnston had given it. And they've lost their major port. So three things. So in most of today's world, we call that game over.
Yeah. So what do you think with those three things? What happens? What do you
Obviously, Davis falls back.
think? Okay.
He runs south like he did all along. Maybe with Robert E. Lee tagging along, Lee may have actually at that point thrown his hands up and said, "I'm done."
Okay.
I could see a scenario where Lee does that, where Lee
Okay.
throws his hands up and says, "I'm done. This was a good idea, but there's no way we can win, especially at now, at this point."
The thing I'm thinking about is the reason I went through the timeline of the secession it's kind of important here because you had this belt of states, Tennessee,
Yep.
North Carolina, and Virginia.
Tennessee's gone completely.
Tennessee's gone.
Virginia is gone.
Virginia's
Obviously,
gone.
the West Virginia part of Virginia is gone at that point.
Mhm.
And I think now you've got the point where, and also, I think Jackson is ordered to pull back. Jackson has his army, which is the only army left, which
and
is
it's operating on the other
Yeah.
side of the Shenandoah Mountains in that valley.
It's a third
completely
the size
separate.
of anything else. So I think he gets ordered to pull back south too at that point.
And
So,
the thing is, Robert E. Lee was offered the command of Union forces.
Yep.
He decided not to because he wanted to go with his state. His state was Virginia. Virginia is now out of this.
yeah, that's why I think that's my scenario where I can see where Robert E. Lee throws his hands up and says, "I'm done."
Mhm.
That there's no point in me continuing this.
But you still have Jefferson Davis, who's a Mississippian. You still have that.
So
Call it the pre-Sumter or the
Yep.
pre-Sumter
the
Confederacy.
deep south,
Mhm.
the deep
Mhm.
south. So he runs back to Montgomery, Alabama,
Mhm.
which I think happens. I
Which
think
was the initial capital.
the
wasn't it?
initial capital, correct.
Mhm.
I think now though, he may try to pull Beauregard back down,
Mhm.
but if we've got all these other things happening, does Halleck order Grant? Halleck is still in charge of the armies. McClellan is not. He's in charge of the Army of the Potomac, but he's not in charge of everything. I
Mhm.
think Halleck orders Grant into a faster pursuit of
Okay.
Beauregard.
Beauregard.
Yeah, that in our timeline that takes about 3 months because
Okay.
they sit there and reorg, build back up. I think wait, we won this, so let's get him. So they run
Okay.
down and they engage Corinth. That army falls back again, more into Mississippi itself,
Okay.
and so maybe you have Vicksburg happening, but maybe not at this point.
Okay.
I think your armies begin consolidating and falling apart because if you're the South, you have a morale issue now
Mhm.
because you have lost your largest port, you suffered a major defeat, You've lost what conceivably could be your best general in Albert Sidney Johnston. And you've taken Virginia out of the mix. So now we're situated, maybe Jackson falls back to Montgomery. Maybe
Or into
whatever's
South Carolina, northern Georgia area. Mhm.
But I think it ends much quicker at this point.
Okay.
I think Grant comes down the Tennessee River through Corinth, pushing towards those forces. They ignore Vicksburg completely at this point because there's not much left with it.
Because the Mississippi doesn't matter if you've taken the cork of the bottle down at New Orleans.
Yep. So he moves that direction. At the same time, McClellan sends troops that pursue Davis as they get through. And I think sometime around the end of 1862, they all catch up to Davis, somewhere around where they did it anyway, somewhere around north to South Carolina. Maybe he makes it all the way to Alabama, maybe. And they capture Davis, and it's game over completely.
Okay.
War ends late 1862.
Okay. So the next question is this, and this is where our fork gets real fun, because our fork grows some legs real quick here.
Yep. Right
now, you've got Abraham Lincoln as president. He was elected in 1860. You've got the Congress he was initially elected with. So in our timeline, when all this stuff finally does happen, 3 years and hundreds of thousands of lives later, Lincoln, really, a lot of people think he's the last casualty of the Civil War. And his vice president is Andrew Johnson, who, former senator from Tennessee,
correct,
from North Carolina. So he's of that, call it upper South, that isn't quite on board with all of this from the very beginning. And he is very conciliatory to the Southern Democrats, to the South, to that cause. And he runs headlong into Northern, what are called radical Republicans, who want a full-blown military occupation of the South. And they want to remind him that you lost a war. And when you lose a war, you don't get to name anything. You don't get to say anything. You get to do what we tell you.
But remember, Hannibal Hamlin was his vice president at this point, not Johnson.
Right.
So he's got another one, and he was from Maine, and he was more of the radical group at that point. Johnson was put on the ticket in our timeline, has more of a conciliatory to the South. So you have a more hardcore Republican, and you've got as vice president, and you've got Thaddeus Stevens in the Senate, who is the leader of the abolitionist group.
Right now, he is.
Yep.
So all of this, the midterms happen in 62 as a split country. There are no congressional elections in the South because they weren't quite. They weren't part of us.
In my scenario, it may not have happened in time.
Yeah, I agree that
it's end of 1862, early 1863, maybe. But
I think this may even go into what we call the campaigning season of 63.
Okay.
But yeah, you don't get a say. You're not in Congress. You threw a temper tantrum and ran away. So no, we're not going to listen to what you have to say. So into the big one we're talking about. Well, let me go back, because here's one big issue that I'm going to bring in right now. And I'm going to talk about Fort Monroe a bit. As we talked about, Monroe, where a lot of this stuff is happening, is at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. It is right by Jamestown and Williamsburg and all of these historical sites for the United States. Fort Virginia, where Monroe was built, was also the site in 1619 where the first African American slaves were sold in the United States. That's where slavery began. And during that lead up period that we were just talking about, before Bull Run, before the Peninsula Campaign, a man named Benjamin Butler, who was a state senator from Massachusetts, was sent to protect Fort Monroe to make sure the same thing didn't happen that had just happened at Fort Sumter, because we realized maybe we didn't have the full plan for the Peninsula Campaign, but we realized, hey, this stuff is kind of important. It'd be helpful to hold on to it. And when he's in command there, one of the things he does is he declares any slave that came to the Union lines basically contraband, property of war. We seize it. We take it away from you because you're at war with us and you're using this resource, these people, you're using them to build forts. You're using them to dig ditches, to build military installations.
Oh, and to feed your troops and to your everything you're using your slaves for is extra manpower that you don't have to find.
Right. So Butler is the first Union commander to start keeping them. He ignores the fugitive slave law because he says, you're no longer part of the United States. That's fine. Our laws don't apply to you anymore. So we're going to keep them. And between that and the importance of slave labor in building defenses during the Peninsula Campaign, basically this is what pushed Abraham Lincoln to the point of issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. The story goes, he waited for a victory. He wanted it to appear as a position of strength, but it was the way the Peninsula Campaign played out that made him decide, I want to do this.
I've got to do it. So he does that. So that means, and then he goes down to New Orleans, and he actually enlists the 1st Louisiana Colored Brigade when he captures New Orleans, which
This
is
being Benjamin Butler.
Benjamin Butler, yes, who actually, sorry about that,
Yeah.
who actually is the actual 1st regiment, colored regiment in the United States Army. So he basically takes freed slaves, gives them a gun, gives them somewhat of a uniform, and puts them in the Army.
Mm-hmm. So the reason I bring this up is this is the huge, after September 1862, the Battle of Antietam, this is when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued. And after that, the war is not about preserving the Union. The war is now what is this about? It's about freeing the slaves, and that is something that the United States, people in the United States say, this is why we're doing it. If the war ends when it does, they don't say that. So we probably spent about an hour talking off podcast about this. So we've got a really interesting scenario for you. Do you want to go ahead and lay out some of it, Rob?
All right, so the war has ended in 1862, late 1862, early 1863, just kind of depends. War is over with. The South is not reconstructed yet, but now we are in this minor little thing called the election of 1864. So George McClellan, he was known as the Little Napoleon. Why? Because he had huge political ambitions. In our timeline, he actually did run against Lincoln as an anti-war Democrat, because he wanted to actually surrender to the South, let them go on their own way. I'm going to end the war. It's not worth this much of a price of blood for us to do this. The other man who was a politician and had obvious political pieces is our old friend Benjamin Butler.
Because Butler had already been elected a state senator in Massachusetts. That's
Yep.
actually how he got his first command, is because he was a state senator and used political friends to get appointed as a commander of almost the Massachusetts gang that got sent south initially, kind of the first state militia that got sent south. So you've got two people, one of whom is the guy that conquered Richmond and has this view of the war was about the Union. The war was about bringing the South back into the Union. We've done that. Let's shake hands and call it a day. And the other side being Benjamin Butler, who is the victor of the largest city in the South. He's the man who
pushes radical absolution, radical let your slaves go. I'm going to free them all. He goes through everywhere he went. He freed the slaves as he went through.
No.
Well,
You're
he did a lot more than free. Yeah,
you're using the wrong article there. Benjamin Butler does not go to Southern planters and say, free your slaves. He goes to them and says, your slaves are free. You don't really have a say in this.
This is true. So he does that. So what you end up with is McClellan ends up being a Democrat. He was a Democrat. Butler was a Republican. Butler decides he wants to run against Abraham Lincoln because we have spilt all this blood, and it's the blood of the boys from Wisconsin. I talked about the big monument there in Madison. You've seen one in Maine. I know I've seen them in other parts of the other, Indiana. Illinois has huge monuments. If you drive through any of the battlefields, it is all that Midwest has all these state monuments. New York has some, but it's all these. And if we're gonna do this, all of that blood has to have meant something. Not just putting the abstract states back together, but the blood we spilt. Granted, it's probably less than half the blood we spilt in the original timeline, but you're still looking at Shiloh being the largest casualties of any two-day battle in the United States ever. And so we have put all this blood down. It has to mean something. So, and in this case, there is no Emancipation Proclamation. Right. Or if there is one, it's treated differently because it was treated after the Union victory at Antietam. Antietam never happens.
Yeah, and one of the other aspects of the Emancipation Proclamation was it was meant to freeze Britain and France. It froze them out. It made Britain has at this point for 50 years been fighting the slave trade off the coast of Africa. They can't. Once the Union makes it about that, they can't get involved. But the Union doesn't need to worry about that because the South just collapsed. So in 1864, you have one general running from the east and one general running from the west with vastly different views of what this war was about and where am I going to take this country. So
McClellan comes across with the idea of the war was fought to preserve the Union. That was the idea we came about from the beginning. We will deal with slavery because slavery is a dying institution, but we need to get the other states back in the Union, reunite the country, and then after we're done with that, we will deal with slavery. But we're going to deal with that. We're going to get everybody back first, then we will deal with slavery on the back end.
And Butler looks at this and says, and by the way, looks at the documentary evidence left by the Confederates. I want to say it was Alexander Stephens of Georgia.
No, there are people that can argue states. There are people that will try and argue states' rights were the cause of the Civil War. Sure, it was the cause, but the root of it was built in slavery.
And Butler says this. You look
We've
at
got to
history.
tear that out.
When you lose what I was just saying, when you lose a war, and I've made a very clear point. I talked about Fair Oaks. I've talked about Bull Run. I've talked about the Merrimack. You know why? When you win a war, you get to name stuff. When you lose a war, your name doesn't matter anymore. You lost this. This war was over slavery, period. That's what you said when you broke away. So guess what? You lost that right. And there's a very clear sense, at least in my mind, and we talked about this earlier, Butler's father had served with Andrew Jackson at New Orleans, at the 1814 Battle of New Orleans.
1814 Battle of New Orleans.
And the Jacksonian democracy is kind of this sense of, don't forget, when the founding fathers started the franchise, you had to be a property owner. So Jacksonian democracy, this era of the common man, as it's so often portrayed, and I'll go ahead and say it was the average of the common white man. I'll say that because Jackson wanted to extend the franchise to the poorer white farmers in the South and the West. Yep. But there's a real sense and a connection to the city of New Orleans and that beautiful history of that mixing of cultures there because of everybody that did come together at 1814. And the fact that Butler is running in 64 as the liberator of New Orleans to carry on this mantle and really form a vision of even what Lincoln said, a new birth of freedom, to extend freedom to all, at this point, all men, all male citizens. But we're moving that forward rather than McClellan's idea of we're just going to, no harm, no foul, what happened, happened, and we're going to move on. Yeah,
we're doing with it.
Kind of a...
Well, yeah, and I think what's interesting with that is the Butler piece then becomes it's everyone's free, everyone's there, and if you don't like it this time, last time when the Civil War happened, you succeeded because Abraham Lincoln won with no votes from the South, and all of those states said he's not my president, we're leaving, and they left. You don't get that choice this time because you don't have a government. You don't have an army. We already beat you. So guess what? You're going to be in submission this time.
And this, you know, in our timeline, I feel like the decision is of Reconstruction kind of feels, I'm reminded a little bit of, this is what I know better. This is European history. One is the Vienna, the Congress of Vienna, where we're going to bring France after Napoleon back in, and we're going to cooperate, and we're going to have a balance, and we're going to move forward together. And the other option is what I would call the Yalta Potsdam. You lost. Good luck. We're going to divide you. You're not going to have a government. You're not even going to have your own currency. We might let you have an army. Might. And I think about when you try and mix those two things together, you get Versailles. And when you mix those two things together, you get what happened with American Reconstruction.
Yep.
It was incomplete.
You didn't finish the job.
Yeah.
Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles directly causes World War II.
And the way Reconstruction happened turned the clock back and prolonged so much struggle in this country.
Absolutely. So if Butler wins, let's talk. Does Butler win, or does McClellan win in that case? I think if Butler gets the nomination, he wins. I really do, because I think his sell is how many people how many of your sons did you give to this cause? It has to mean something. We can't just let them back. We have to root out the evil of slavery.
And the other thing is, Butler, we kind of talked about this, and I'm sorry, Robert, I set you up.
No, you're good.
With the you're going to take the Mcclellan and I'm going to take the Butler.
Yeah.
Because Butler, he's got a vision that ties into American history and where America is going. What are we going to do moving forward?
We've won this. It has to mean something. And I think the true vision of even Abraham Lincoln was move the country forward, but moving the country forward in a specific way for the 1864 election.
Yeah.
And that's why he beat McClellan at that point, because all McClellan wanted to do was compromise and let bygones be bygones, and we're all one big blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I agree with you. I think he wins the North, which is the only place voting other than maybe Tennessee and West Virginia.
I think West Virginia votes, but Tennessee, maybe. And actually what may have happened at that point with Tennessee, what a lot of people don't realize is the vast majority of East Tennessee was pro-Union, the Knoxville type area. Tennessee you may have ended up with an East Tennessee and a West Tennessee state.
Okay.
At the
kind of
end
like
of the
what
day.
happened with Virginia.
Yeah. Yeah. You may have ended up
Okay.
with a Eastern Tennessee. Jackson maybe would be the name of the state, because there was some talk about at one point that being, but doing Tennessee as a split where at least for that election they get to vote.
Okay.
Because the Knoxville area was very pro-Union.
Yeah. So I honestly think, knowing a little bit about the state right next door, maybe you have a Jackson that includes Asheville, Boone, certain parts of North Carolina, because they also had a very similar bent at that point. But map drawing aside, you've got Butler, president in 1864. Is he able to? What we talked about what he wants to do.
Well,
What
the
does
first, the 14th and 15th Amendment, slavery is gone. People, every former slave now has the right to vote. Former male slave now has the right to vote. That happens immediately. I actually wonder if Butler would have been successful in pushing reparations through. Because Thaddeus Stevens, if Stevens didn't feel like he had to compromise to get what he wanted, Thaddeus Stevens would have been as radical as they come.
And this was a shock to you. I know this was a shock to you when I reminded you of this. In our timeline, Butler was as radical as Stevens.
Oh, yeah.
Butler,
I had forgot about Butler being that way.
In the House, led the impeachment of Andrew Johnson.
So
yeah.
Well, and you've got a radical Republican president versus Johnson, who's definitely a moderate at best. After Johnson comes Grant, who is basically there to kind of calm everybody down at that point. Grant viewed his job as president to calm everybody down on the radical side and the other side, to kind of look, we got to move forward as a country.
I would say Grant reminds me a little bit of a Eisenhower.
Yes.
For a couple of reasons. One is obvious why they're there. They're the president. They're the, or they're the general that everybody remembers. But the other thing is what Grant does. So Johnson just shuts down everything that the Congress is trying to do for the freedmen in the South. Grant doesn't shut it down. And when Grant starts meeting violent opposition, he answers it with the United States military.
Well, and in our fork, you don't get a Grant as president.
Right.
You get Butler.
But you've
And-
still got somebody pushing more of these policies, and somebody pushing these policies with what is perceived as a military background because he's the victor of New Orleans.
Yep. So you put that out, and you don't get a Johnson presidency. There is no impeachment of Andrew Johnson.
Right.
Radical, what we would call radical Reconstruction happens.
Okay.
Where it comes,
Mhm.
it never slows down. And,
Okay.
and I think honestly, the bigger piece of this is not only the radical Reconstruction, but also, pardon me, the actual what happens if Nathan Bedford Forrest tries to form the Ku Klux Klan, he is hunted like a dog.
He's hung.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about this, but there was a debate. We could. Are for ex-Confederates prosecuted in this? He is, because he doesn't give up.
I think they're not prosecuted initially, but if they continue advocating, so Braxton Bragg, Jefferson Davis, the guys who continue fighting or want to continue fighting,
Okay.
who if you're a Confederate, your only hope of survival is the James Longstreet approach.
Okay.
Longstreet, after the Civil War, said we are a conquered people and should behave as such.
Okay.
And if you don't take that approach, you very quickly find yourself in prison.
Okay.
And or hung, depending on how if Nathan Bedford Forrest tries to do what he did, he is hunted, and if he lives long enough to make it to a trial, he's hung. I'm not convinced he lives long enough to make it to a trial. At that, I think
he's shot trying to escape.
If not trying to escape, he's shot because he refuses to give up.
The other beautiful thing about this being the video episode, you can see me winking when I'm saying shot trying
to give yeah. If not that, he's but it's one of those things where I do think the radical control flows down through the way we approach Reconstruction.
Okay.
And it's if you're not a James Longstreet, that we're a conquered people, behave as such. If you're a Braxton Bragg that continues to try to agitate because he did, if you're a Jeff Davis who refuses to give up, if you're a Nathan Bedford Forrest, if you're any of those groups, you're at a minimum arrested, potentially hung, and or shot. Take your pick.
Yeah.
At a minimum, you're arrested. You're spending some time, and oh, by the way, there's not this trial by jury. They're treated much like the Lincoln conspirators. It is military trial.
Okay.
Because we're running a Reconstruction. That's a military occupation. There is no civilian trial. You're still instigating violent rebellion against the United States.
So
at that point, the rebellion part becomes as important as the free the slaves part. He flips the script on McClellan at that point.
Okay.
We freed the slaves, so now y'all all better get on board.
So going forward, kind of in our timeline, we talked about Grant coming in.
Right.
1876. By that point, by 76, the southern states are allowed to vote again.
Right.
How does this play out in this other thing we've created?
I think the radical Republicans maintain control because you're voting under the auspices of federal troops.
Okay.
So the blacks all get to vote.
Yes.
African American total mannerism. Everyone's voting. All the whites are voting. And if you try, and remember, if you kept trying to push slavery, what happened? You spent some time in the Hokie.
You're at least disenfranchised.
At a minimum.
At least disenfranchised.
Yeah. yeah, if you're not in the Hokie already or shot or hung, you're disenfranchised too.
Mhm.
Because I think that was one thing that was very important for Reconstruction in Lincoln's mind, is he re-enfranchised all the Confederates to where
So-
they could all vote. I think in this case, the radical Republicans keep control at
Okay.
least for an additional, I'd go 20 to 40 years.
Okay.
And then maybe at that point, not, but I think at that point, you fundamentally change the country.
You really have. You
Yeah,
really have.
Woodrow Wilson does not exist in that timeline.
He does, but I know what you're saying.
Yeah, not as a president. Not as a president.
Absolutely. Okay.
So
Yeah, I think
it moves forward, and there is no 1860 civil rights movement because there was no need for an 1860 civil rights movement.
19.
That's right, 1960.
We're
I always
100
forget-
years later.
Yeah, it took 100 years. I don't think you
It
have
did
that
take
because you
100
don't-
years.
Yeah, I don't think you have that because you don't need it.
Mhm.
That all got fixed early. Because you have to remember the early part of Reconstruction, it happened. Fort Bend County, the county I live in Texas,
Mhm.
had a black sheriff, African-American sheriff, right after the Civil War, who subsequently served in the Texas legislature as a senator. My children went to his school, the school that is named after him. So
I am coming to you guys from Concord, North Carolina. A lot of you associate me a little more with DC, but this is where I'm originally from. This is why I got sent to the principal's office for calling the state of draft dodge. That's beside the point. Haven't forgotten that one. About 5 miles from where I am right now was the first African-American owned textile mill in the country. W.G. Coleman, right after the Civil War, he founded his own textile mill. And that's an important part of this, was that both political, like you're talking about, but economic, like I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You end up with the equality immediately, and things are changed.
Getting
And
towards it, moving towards it a lot quicker than we did.
a lot quicker than we did, and a lot calmer than we did.
Okay.
I don't think you have anything that happens is not nearly as violent, not
Mhm.
nearly as disruptive to the country. It's
much
more,
Mhm.
it's more. So most people don't know the story about the city of Houston.
Okay.
Houston was desegregated.
Okay.
So the first thing you have to know is in 1918, there was a massive riot called the Camp Logan riots, and it may have been 1917. I'd have to double check. So basically where Memorial Park is in Houston, Memorial Park is Houston's Central Park. It's a big, huge park,
Mhm.
west part of Houston. During World War I, they built a huge encampment there to train soldiers for World War I.
Mhm.
There was a huge segment of African-American soldiers there.
Yes.
They were very plainly instructed not to go into town and, hey, we're a Southern city for all that that's worth, good, bad, and otherwise. So one did. He was accused of raping a woman. Houston police picked him up. Several of his soldiers decided to go spring him from the Hokie. So they marched on the city of Houston with their M1 Garand rifles that they used in World War I.
I'm not going to be a nerd. That was in 1903. Springfield M1 was World War II.
Okay. That's right. The 1903. So they marched with their rifles and bayonets.
Mhm.
3 days of rioting, hundreds dead. 1860s roll around, or 1960s. I keep doing that today.
Yeah.
Roll around. And Houston basically says, we're not doing this again.
Okay.
That was such a devastating event to the city. I grew up here and did not know about it till I got in college.
I did not know about W.G. Coleman until I did some of my own looking on my own. And it's
because it was such a devastating blow to our city.
Mhm.
So Bill Lawson, who is the pastor of Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, a magnificent gentleman. He sat down with several business leaders and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. The Woolworth counter downtown, several of my men are going to show up and sit down and have lunch.
Okay.
And everybody's going to be okay with it. Everybody agreed because we don't want to do this again. So because of that, when you look through the civil rights history in the city of Houston, you'll see some minor riots, mainly around where Texas Southern University exists, but nothing like you see in the other cities.
Okay.
And it's because Bill Lawson sat down and said, we're not doing this again. We will sit down and work this out together. I think the overall arch of any further civil rights takes that pattern.
Okay.
As it moves forward, because there was enough established at the beginning after in our scenario, there was enough established. We had 40 years of sit down, shut up, and go over to the corner, or else, that you would be with it.
Okay.
So I think the any further desegregation, civil rights that need to occur in that sense.
Okay. And by the way, with African Americans as open and active participants in the political system.
Yeah. And that's why I think it occurs that way.
Okay.
That basically Houston's desegregation pattern is the pattern for the entire country.
Okay.
Anything else that occurs like that.
Okay.
Which,
I fundamentally object to modeling things off of Texas, but I'll give you this one, the way you laid it out.
Yeah, because it was that was the right. Texas had a unique experience in World War I. You had businessmen in Houston and African American leaders in Houston that both agreed we can't do that again to our city. And that's why I think that right there, it becomes the model.
Okay. All right.
Because you've got the political power. If you're African American, you've been voting for close to 100 years now. You've been an active part of the participant. Okay, we've got to clean some things up, guys. Let's sit down and talk about how we do it.
Okay.
So like you said, this fort gets some legs quickly. Because the other part of it is, and this is one reason why I wanted to do this one, you destroy the lost cause myth with this. I've never been a lost cause person. I'm like, y'all are stupid. It was all about states' rights. Yeah, there was states' rights involved, but the core of that states' rights was slavery. So, to go political for just a second, the absolute worst thing that ever happened to the argument of states' rights was the states' rights got tied into slavery. States' rights is a legitimate political argument, but if you tied into slavery, now you can't discuss it anymore.
Okay.
And so it was not about state rights. It was about slavery at its core. State rights was the tool you used to keep it moving forward.
So in 1864, you'd have been a Butler voter.
Probably so at that point, because it's one of those deals where I tend to agree. If you spill blood, it's got to mean something. And it wasn't a little bit of even if you threw out everything from the Peninsula Campaign forward, it still was not, like you said, Shiloh shocked the world. And the only reason Shiloh is not as much talked about as a lot of the other battles, it was a Western theater battle.
Yeah.
So it didn't have all of the extra pieces with it. So that's about it. I think we covered that fork.
I mean, every single time we come back to this and as we're wrapping up, I think Don always likes to ask me, "Well, do you have anything else?" And every single time I realize, like, you and I just changed 150 years of American history.
Very quickly.
What else do you want from us?
It's like, come on, we fix this.
Yeah.
We fix this.
So, well, I hope everybody enjoyed listening and watching this episode. So, should be coming out early January. If you did like this, please let us know. Drop us a review. Obviously, these take a little bit more work to put together, but it's something we're interested in for a couple of episodes. We'd like to start getting that together. And also, if you did decide to just listen to us on the audio, whatever way you did listen to us, shoot us a review there, shoot us a rating. We'd like to get that up just to get more people listening to us, to get us higher rated. And also, finally, the good thing about being a video podcast is you can see there's a reason we do it audio. We all have voices that are made for radio. So if you're out there and enjoying this, sign up too. You too can contribute to it. We'd love to get some more people involved.
And thank you for listening. We appreciate it. Go leave us a review, as Chris said. And we hope all of you enjoyed today's episode, and keep looking at where forks in history occur.
Yeah.
Reach out to us. Then I also want to plug our other podcast, The Room Where It Happened. We have a new episode coming in January for Mission Control in January of 1986. So that should be an interesting episode. I invite you to listen to that podcast and follow it as well.
So, Robert, just going to finish this up. If you were to come to a fork in the road, what should you do?
Take the best fork available.
All right. Wish everyone a happy new year. Bye.